Alright, so for this video, I want to talk about what happened to the Minnesota Vikings after the Herschel Walker trade. This impactful transaction has been labeled as a great trade robbery, an extremely lopsided deal for the Vikings, as this trade led to the Dallas Cowboys becoming a dynasty. Now, I'm not going to go too much in depth about this trade, but instead, I want to talk about the years afterward regarding the Minnesota Vikings. I think it's kind of remarkable that the Vikings didn't just completely collapse after this trade. In fact, it's amazing that the Vikings were quite competitive for a long period of time, one of the better teams in the NFC. The Dallas Cowboys traded Herschel Walker to the Minnesota Vikings on October 12, 1989. What I'm showing is this trade in full, as I'm using this graphic from Wikipedia because I think it's the easiest to read and follow. So where I want to begin is to briefly talk about the 5 players aside from Walker in this trade. If any of these 5 players were released by then Dallas Cowboys coach and lead personnel man Jimmy Johnson, they would turn into draft picks. Then Minnesota Vikings GM Mike Lynn thought he could take advantage of this new coach from college, as he thought Johnson would love these players, whom Johnson labeled as cast-offs. But the new Cowboys coach, most importantly, wanted the draft picks, and also wanted to keep the players, which ultimately put Mike Lynn in a bind, as this led to Jimmy Johnson to negotiate by sending some draft capital back to Minnesota. What I want to mention is that 4 of these players were starters on Minnesota's 1988 team. Now, I understand linebacker Jesse Solomon had knee issues, but with that said, going forward, this trade kind of hurt Minnesota's depth on defense. But of course, what really hurt is that Minnesota would have to give their first and second round picks to Dallas in 1990, 1991, and 1992. A crazy amount of draft capital in an era before free agency, which would start in 1993. But worth mentioning also is that Minnesota, they had a lot of talent everywhere on their team in the late 80s, which I'll get to later on. So with Herschel Walker in purple, Minnesota did make the postseason again in 1989, but lost to the 49ers for a second consecutive year in the playoffs. Then Minnesota, they missed the postseason in 1990 and 1991. And head coach Jerry Burns was fired. There are questions if the offensive scheme was right for Walker, and questions as to why Herschel Walker didn't get more touches. After the 1991 season, Walker would not return to the Vikings and would then sign with the Philadelphia Eagles. So a quick recap. You have the Minnesota Vikings having to give their first and second round picks in a 3-year span to Dallas at a time with no free agency. Furthermore, with that lack of draft picks in the early rounds, you can't improve your roster, you can't improve your depth. Additionally, the Vikings had some great players in the late 80s who were getting near the end of their careers in Keith Millard, Joey Browner, Scott Studwell, and Anthony Carter. Worth mentioning somehow, the Vikings, they did get a second round pick by trading Millard to Seattle after missing all the 1991 season due to a knee injury. But anyways, with what I just mentioned previously, I would say it was pretty amazing that Minnesota, they did not collapse, and instead from 1992 to 2000, Minnesota only missed the playoffs once. So how did this happen in a very competitive NFC Central division? Now I'm going to mention 3 items. These aren't in any particular order. Comment below if you'd like to add anything else. But to begin, what really helped Minnesota is that defensive tackle John Randle and wide receiver Cris Carter just somehow, miraculously, landed in Minnesota. Cris Carter was previously with Philadelphia and had alcohol and drug issues, which led to his release by the Eagles, and was signed by the Vikings off waivers for $100. Seriously, that's it, only $100. And then John Randle, when undrafted, supposedly was signed by the Vikings after he was able to meet a weight requirement by hiding chains in his sweatpants. What transpired is that Carter and Randle, they produced greatly for the Vikings, and these two both became Hall of Famers, and not just debatable Hall of Famers. These are 2, no doubt about it, Hall of Famers. And I understand they did not make it on the first ballot, but that's another story. But the point is, somehow, these 2 outstanding players somehow just wound up in Minnesota and produced greatly for the Vikings for a lengthy period. The next item to mention about Minnesota's success is that for the 1992 season, Minnesota, they made a great hire, making Dennis Green their head coach. And if this hire happened today, people's heads would be exploding, questioning how can you hire a coach with such a poor record in college? But hiring Green would wind up being tremendous. Moreover, Green, he put together a great coaching staff. But what I think about most in regards to Dennis Green and the Vikings in the 90s is that no matter who played quarterback for Minnesota, the signal caller was always productive, as Green made the playoffs with so many different quarterbacks like Rich Gannon, Jim McMahon, Warren Moon, Brad Johnson, who was a Vikings 1992 9th round pick, Randle Cunningham, Jeff George, Dante Culpepper, and I'll even throw in Sean Salisbury. The last item to mention, which will tie into one of my final statements, is that Minnesota did a pretty good job drafting previously to the Herschel Walker trade and after the Herschel Walker trade with two different GMs. Yes, I mentioned previously, Minnesota had some great players who were near the end of their careers, but they also had some other great players who they got from the draft, which really tells you how much talent the Vikings had. Anyways, the Vikings had great offensive line play thanks to their draft picks with players like Randall McDaniel, Gary Zimmerman, Todd Stussy, Matt Burke, Corey Stringer. Also, to go along with John Randle, the defensive line was strong with picks like Chris Dolman and Henry Thomas. Running back Terry Allen was a 1990 9th round pick for the Vikings, who twice rushed for 1,000 yards in a season for Minnesota, while Herschel Walker, he never rushed for 1,000 yards in a season with the Vikings. And now, I'm just going to stick with draft picks during the Dennis Green era, but during this time Minnesota, they drafted explosive running back Robert Smith. And in 1991, in the 3rd round, this was a pick from Dallas that Jimmy Johnson gave to Mike Lynn. But with that pick, the Vikings, they selected Jake Reed, as Reed and Carter was perhaps the best receiving duo in the mid-90s. And of course, I also have to mention that Minnesota, they selected the ultra-talented Randy Moss in the 1st round in 1998. Another pick to mention is linebacker Ed McDaniel, who was selected in the 5th round in 1992, a very good pick. And then I also want to show the Vikings who they selected in 1995. Now I understand the 1st round pick, Derek Alexander, didn't quite have the impact the Vikings would have liked, but the other picks I'm showing really helped the Vikings, especially the picks of Orlando Thomas and Corey Fuller. And these picks really improved the secondary. Also, Jason Fisk, he was solid on that D-line. So I understand you're not going to hit on every pick, but I felt that Minnesota, they did a pretty good job drafting and developing. It's pretty amazing that Minnesota did not collapse and was very competitive in the 90s. I understand why Minnesota wanted Herschel Walker made the trade, and I understand looking back, the package sent to Dallas looks horrible from Minnesota's side. But I want to ask, if Minnesota didn't make the Herschel Walker trade and had all those picks in the 1st and 2nd round, would Minnesota be able to get past San Francisco, Green Bay, or Dallas? I'll throw in Dallas, assuming that Jimmy Johnson would have done his magic. If he made the trade with Cleveland, the Browns were also interested in Walker. But anyways, I'm not sure. Minnesota, they had a lot of talent in the 90s, but those Dallas and San Francisco teams in the early 90s were so good. A part of me thinks that Minnesota would have made a Super Bowl if they kept those draft picks, but I don't know. Let me know what you think in the comments. Thank you so much for all your support. I greatly appreciate it. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and thank you so much once again. What happened to the Minnesota Vikings after the Herschel Walker trade?